Hey, true crime fans. Welcome back to For Criming Out Loud. This is our bedtime series called Crime Me to Sleep, and we've been reading While Idaho Slept. This is the 12th episode, so if you're new here, make sure you subscribe so you can go into the playlist and start really any of the true crime books that we've covered from the very beginning. Let's get into episode 12 of While Idaho Slept. Chapter 53. There were non-believers in Kohberger's guilt, partly because of what they had heard online about the alleged weakness of the prosecution's case. Some online sleuths had even been charmed by Kohberger's public profile as a tortured soul, and social media threads about his innocence proliferated. For what appeared to be the first time in his life, Kohberger started getting love letters. They arrived at the Latah County Jail by the handful. Criminologist Michael Arntfield, one-time police detective and now co-director of the Murder Accountability Project in Washington, D.C., a think tank assisting in the investigation of unsolved murders, was not surprised that some wanted to believe in Kohberger's innocence. It's traumatizing to think that there are people wired like this, Arntfield says. People don't want to believe in monsters, but if the information that had emerged publicly about him was true, Arntfield says, Kohberger had all the telltale characteristics of an organized night stalker, someone who plans his killings, then preys on his victims in the dark. And he's probably a psychopath, Arntfield adds. A neuropsychiatric disorder marked by deficient emotional responses and lack of empathy, psychopathy often results in antisocial deviance and criminal behavior. But Arntfield could also see why Kohberger's supporters remained unconvinced by the actual evidence against him. Other than the DNA, it's circumstantial, Arntfield says. And amateur investigators tended to think, mistakenly, that circumstantial evidence is inherently weak. But before the millions of cameras in the United States, he observes, that's how almost every crime was solved. Arntfield's years of experience led him to believe that, in addition to psychopathy, Kohberger most likely suffered from paraphilisis, or atypical sexual fantasies. I think I said that right. Paraphilisias. And he's probably weapon-focused, Arntfield says. A lot of time would be spent thinking about it, shopping for it, looking at it. The K-bar knife was long. The female victims on King Road were small. One could imagine their stalker obsessing about such a weapon's power over them. The average psychopath, Arntfield is careful to add, doesn't roll out of bed one morning and immediately take up murder. It represents the graduation of previous offenses. In Kohberger's case, there could be a precursor attack or attacks in the vicinity of where he was living or working that are of interest to law enforcement. There may have even been previous violent crimes. Kohberger is not a serial killer by definition, Arntfield explains, but the crime has many of the hallmarks of serial homicides: targeting strangers, paraphilic in nature, excessive violence, stalking and planning, recognizance of the location. He adds, and the victims are typical of a serial doer's fantasy, someone the offender sees as a type of ideal partner that they could never have, very public-facing, attractive co-eds. Kohberger might not have killed before, Arntfield is saying, but if he was going to kill, then the young women on King Road made sense as his victims, given Kohberger's inability to connect romantically with so-called popular girls. Serial killers have to start somewhere. While police had not yet linked Koberger to any other crimes, some of the results of their search of the Koberger family home in Pennsylvania raised disturbing questions. The application for the search warrant had spelled out that police were looking for, among many other things, any property belonging to the victims or the surviving roommates of the King Road homicides, since killers often take trophies. While there were no items belonging to the victims cataloged in the search inventory, it was noted that 2 ID cards had been found inside a glove that was stuffed inside a box. Dateline later reported that a source had told them the ID cards were the driver's licenses of 2 young women, neither of whom had been associated with the King Road homicides. 2 women whom Koberger had apparently known in the past, and whose license he had hidden away in a glove, which was hidden away in a box. They don't just roll out of bed and commit murder, Arntfeld had said. It was a graduation of offenses. Chapter 54. Chief Fry, of course, was a firm believer in his case against Koberger. The evidence pointed to him, but so did the sentiments of many of Koberger's past associates. Within 1 hour of releasing Koberger's name to the press, Fry said, the Moscow PD had over 400 callers to their tip line, offering additional, troubling information about the man. And as the media dug into Koberger's past, a pattern of hostility toward women emerged. What Fry definitely didn't want was so much media presence that when the time came for Koberger's murder trial, it would be hard to find an impartial jury in North Idaho. This is one of the reasons that we are holding everything close. We are protecting the integrity of this case, he told News Nation. We want unbiased individuals in this case. We want people to not know all the facts. If too many local people knew too much about the case beforehand, the trial would be moved to a larger county, and Fry wanted Koberger to be convicted of the quadruple murders in the place that had been affected the most. Even if that wasn't a possibility, Fry was hopeful about the prospect of his community being given an opportunity to heal. Things were a lot different than just 3 weeks earlier when Chief Fry and several of his officers had appeared at the King Road residence with a U-Haul, pickup trucks, and official police vehicles to personally collect the victims' belongings. The team had lugged boxes and plastic storage containers across the ice-covered communal parking lot, looking like a family helping one of their own move houses. Fry himself had attempted to back the U-Haul up the driveway, but the slope was so icy he had stopped halfway. He let the truck gate be opened right there, and for most of the morning, Fry and his officers had done the intimate transporting of the 4 victims' earthly possessions from one arm to another. Somebody carried a bag of shoes. Somebody else lugged a laundry hamper. There was a white desk chair on wheels being carried. Then 2 cardboard boxes had been stacked into the arms of an officer with the word State Police in solid white block letters across his back as he puffed out cold air. Nobody had spoken during the very grim undertaking. Now Chief Fry and his team felt a sense of cautious optimism. Nothing would bring back the King Road victims, but the mood was lighter and almost everything had immediately changed. I think that gives a great relief to our organization, a great relief to our community, Fry said. And in this case, the state, the nation, and I think even the world. Chief Fry had spent nearly 2 months being scrutinized on the international stage. Millions had watched his every move, so he knew the global impact of Koberger's arrest. When confronted by a reporter about whether or not he felt vindicated that his investigation was now being seen, in retrospect, as relatively expedient given the challenging and horrific circumstances, Chief Fry answered humbly. "What I feel is, we did our job, and we did it right," he said. "We're not a prideful group." It hadn't always been so easy, procedurally or emotionally, for many of his officers. Fry had brought in mental health counselors for members of his team who had been closest to the case, something he'd been advocating for in the police department for years. "It was 4 people murdered with the use of a knife," Fry said. He paused, then added, "There's things that you don't forget when you go on any of these calls." The blood alone was enough to cause nightmares. Each human body holds roughly a gallon of it, and 4 gallons were at least partially spilled that night inside 1122 King Road. The unfortunate truth about blood loss, however, is that losing just 20% of the body's supply can be fatal. Complete drainage, known in the movies as bleeding out, is infrequently the cause of death, says forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Baden, host of HBO's Autopsy and an expert consultant in some of the world's most infamous murder cases. In fact, the body almost often bleeds into itself, Baden explains, particularly when the vital organs have been attacked. Most of the blood required for life usually remains inside of us, he is saying, just not where it belongs anymore. If you're stabbed in the chest and yet you end up on your back, there may not be any blood observed because the blood is pooling in the abdominal areas, Baden says. It doesn't come out of the stab wound except by gravity. If the body is turned over, the blood will come out. Photographs of the exterior of the King Road house, with blood having found its way down the foundation, seemed to indicate gravity had been working against at least one of the victims. Baden adds, and you don't die from the stab wound. It cuts through nerve tissues in the skin and you feel it, but a death usually occurs from the loss of blood, which takes time. The bigger the blood vessel cut, the quicker the blood loss to the brain, which is ultimately the cause of death in a stabbing incident. The brain turns off after it doesn't get enough oxygen, Baden says. The brain will go first, and then the heart follows. Several minutes could pass before death by stabbing. There are exceptions that are grotesque to think about. Occasionally, a stab wound to the skull from a very heavy knife with a strong person, with a puncture to the brain, can cause loss of consciousness, but other than that, a stab doesn't cause unconsciousness immediately, Baden adds. This seemed to imply that the King Road homicide victims may have lived until after their attacker had left. Depending on their wounds, the victims may have moved themselves away from the initial point of attack, and they may have known that they were dying. For police officers like Fry and his team, visualizing the crime scene as they had found it was bad enough. To picture the moments before the victims' deaths was horrific. First responders saw what others weren't allowed to see. The images were often imprinted permanently and sometimes caused psychological fractures in those whose job it was to see them. Absorbing that pain was the cost of justice. The brain goes first, Baden had said, and the heart follows. That concludes episode 12 of While Idaho Slept. If you're enjoying this new bedtime book series so far, please make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thank you guys so much for being here. I truly appreciate your support in this new series, Crime Me to Sleep. Until next time, good night.